Welcome everyone to Raise the Roof. Ideas have consequences, and so today my co-host Leroy Hill and I are joined by Kevin Briggins to offer a biblically sound and philosophically robust discussion of Margret Sanger's 1922 book, The Pivot of Civilization. We'll show how Sanger's social Darwinism shaped the eugenic mission of Planned Parenthood, influenced the Western worldview, and maybe even deformed the theology of many Christians. Before we dive into Sanger's book, let me offer some insight into the events that shaped her worldview. Margaret Louise Sanger, also known as Margaret Slee from her second marriage, was born in 1879 in Corning, New York. Her father, Michael Higgins, was an Irish-born Civil War veteran and free-thinking socialist. Higgins was a talker and not a doer who barely eked out a living, but involved himself heavily in various radical socialist, anti-Roman Catholic, and utopian causes. Later in life, Sanger celebrated her father's radicalism as the spring from which she drank and modeled her own activism after his example. It's also clear that her father's atheism influenced in some way her own views on God. Here is how Sanger herself defined her religious view in 1957 on the Mike Wallace Show.
What are your religious beliefs, Mrs. Sanger? Do you believe in a God in the sense of a divine being who rewards or punishes people after death?
Well, I have a different attitude about the divine. I feel that we have divinity within us, and the more we express the good part of our lives, the more the divine within us expresses itself. I suppose I would call myself an Episcopalian by religion, and there's many other. If you've traveled around the world, you get quite a bit of the feeling of all religions have so much alike in the divine part of our own being. And I suppose you just couldn't put that in a book, or you couldn't put it into a phrase or a sentence.
Do you believe in sin? When I say believe, I don't mean believe in committing sin. Do you believe there is such a thing as sin?
Well, I think the greatest sin in the world is bringing children into the world that have disease from their parents, that have no chance in the world to be a human being, practically. Delinquents, prisoners, all sorts of things just marked when they're born. That, to me, is the greatest sin that people can commit.
But sin in the ordinary sense that we regard it, do you believe or do you not believe?
Well, what would they be?
Do you believe that infidelity is a sin?
Well, I'm not going to specify what I think is sin. I've stated what I think is the worst sin.
Yes, but then you asked me to say what, and I said what, and you refused to answer me?
Yes, I don't know about infidelity. It has so many personalities to it, and what a person's own belief is. I couldn't generalize any of those things as being sin.
Murder is a sin.
Well, I naturally think murder is a sin or not. It's a terrible act.
Turning now to Sanger's mother, she was a Roman Catholic Irish-American who passed away at the age of 48 due to tuberculosis when Sanger was just 19 years old. Sanger firmly believed that her mother's illness was made worse by the fact that she had given birth to 11 children. Her tragic death deeply affected Sanger, solidifying her conviction that no woman should have to endure a life of sexual slavery to her husband or forced childbirth due to laws against contraception. Here again, on the Mike Wallace Show, Sanger makes her views clear.
Let me ask you this first of all. Why did you do it? I realize that you had an intellectual conviction that birth control was a boon to mankind, but I'm sure that others have that conviction too. And so what I'd like to know is this. What events, what emotions in your life made Margret Sanger a crusader for birth control?
Well, Mr. Wallace, it's hard to say that any one thing has made one do this or that. I think from the very beginning, I came of a large family. My mother died young, 11 children. That made an impression on me as a child. I was a trained nurse, went among the people. I saw women who asked to have some means whereby they wouldn't have to have another pregnancy too early after the last child, the last abortion, which many of them had. So there's a number of things that are one after the other that really made you feel that you had to do something.
It's safe to say that Sanger's childhood experience deeply shaped her life in 4 ways. It shaped her political philosophy, her relationship with men, her feminist activism, and her spiritual life. First, let me say a word about her political philosophy. In the early part of the 20th century, Sanger's worldview was shaped by people such as Emma Goldman, who was a feminist political anarchist, Havelock Ellis, a famous British sex psychologist, and H.G. Wells, the popular English author of books like War of the Worlds, Her Lover, and one of the most influential progressives of the 20th century. One quick aside on H.G. Wells. Wells, like Sanger, was a eugenist, or what some might call a social Darwinist. Wells was opposed to democracy and believed that the world should be governed by the elites who are trained in science. The common thread among each of these men and women who influenced Sanger on some level was a devotion to socialist or progressive causes and the Darwinian worldview. If you need some insight into Darwin, check out episode 25 of Raise the Roof. Second, regarding Sanger's personal life, she modeled the new morality she hoped would reshape the world. In her book, Woman of Valor, Margret Sanger and the Birth Control Movement in America, Eileen Chesler writes, quote, Sanger would eventually learn to satisfy her own erotic strivings and court the seductions of men, but she would never allow herself to be defined by them. She would fall in love and marry twice, yet never be beholden to these relationships. She would indeed maintain a goal of empowering women to live independent, self-fulfilled lives as her social mission. Third, related to Sanger's feminist activism, the Freedom from Religion Foundation attributed her so-called heroic activism to her experience with religious oppression. Here again a long quote. As a child, Sanger was introduced to the power of the Catholic Church when the local priest locked the doors of the town hall to prevent agnostic Robert Ingersoll from speaking. She wrote in her autobiography of the spellbinding experience of hearing Ingersoll speak in the woods instead. Sanger would later repeatedly experience being locked out of public halls, even countries, under Catholic pressure. Her experience doing nursing to the poor in New York City as a young mother herself galvanized her conviction that women had the right to control fertility. The turning point was witnessing the death of Sadie Sachs, 28, from a second illegal abortion. When Sachs had pleaded with her doctor for birth control, a term coined by Sanger, he had responded, "Tell Jake to sleep on the roof." So it's stories like this that inspired Sanger to promote a new moral standard for sexual liberation, birth control, and racial purification. Her reproductive moral code of quality, not quantity, led Sanger to support the 1927 Supreme Court decision Buck v. Bell, which upheld forced sterilization of individuals deemed unfit as a means of eugenic-based social improvement. Sanger's mission to rid the human race of what she called the deplorables won the support of white nationalists, segregationists, and white supremacist groups such as the KKK. To achieve her goal of racial purification, Sanger opened clinics targeting the poor and minority women throughout the United States and eventually founded Planned Parenthood, which is today the largest abortion provider in the United States. In 1917, Sanger founded the magazine The Birth Control Review. Here's a good summary of her own publication's racial bias from Human Life International.
In 1917, Sanger began publishing her famous journal, The Birth Control Review. For over 20 years, this publication was a haven for racists, eugenicists, and even Nazi writers. The journal was devoted to the legalization of birth control. However, its main theme was eugenics. Its masthead was birth control, to create a race of thoroughbreds. Often, this journal would highlight the aim of the American Birth Control League, later Planned Parenthood. The aim was, quote, to promote eugenic birth selection throughout the United States so that there may be more well-born and fewer ill-born children, a stronger, healthier, and more intelligent race, unquote. White supremacist ideas drove Sanger's efforts to limit the reproduction of the so-called unfit through sterilization, birth control, and abortion. The weak-minded, the mentally defective, and those affected by poverty served solely as a scapegoat, since many African American communities suffered from unemployment, poverty, and crime. Sanger herself said, "We need not more of the fit, but fewer of the unfit. The propagation of the degenerate, the imbecile, the feeble-minded should be prevented."
Finally, related to her religious pursuits, I'll point out two things. First, Sanger's magazine, Women Rebel, which she started in 1914, gives us a glimpse into her religious worldview. On the magazine's masthead, Sanger added the slogan, "No gods, no masters," a phrase she borrowed from the anarchist social labor group International Women of the World. That slogan gives us a good idea of her thoughts on God, human nature, and her cultural agenda. Second, in 1915, Sanger's 5-year-old daughter, Peggy, died of pneumonia. In the years that followed, Sanger was haunted by dreams of infant girls and claimed to see and speak to Peggy through occult rituals. Ultimately, as we heard earlier, in her own words, Sanger pursued the God within herself for peace and comfort. Margret Sanger died in 1966 at the age of 86 of congestive heart failure in Tucson, Arizona. So with this background in mind, let me bring in Leroy and Kevin to discuss Sanger's book, The Pivot of Civilization. Welcome, welcome, Kevin. You are joining us today, my brother. It's been a little time since you've been with us. I mean, we've been on some other things together, but it's been a while since you've been together with Leroy on a Hill. And I think it's been our show on universities that we did a while back. Yeah, that's yeah. So we've had you there. But for those that don't watch every episode, why don't you introduce yourself and tell folks who you are, and then also maybe why this topic of Sanger is of interest to you.
Yeah. So my name is Kevin Briggins. I'm a retired Air Force veteran, a former intelligence analyst. And so I do a lot of talking in the geopolitical space. I have a podcast called Informed Takes that I do with my co-host, Devin Smith. And I also work a lot with race and culture and justice with the Center for Biblical Unity, where I work as the directing manager. And I do a podcast with them called Off Code, where we discuss issues within the Black community from a biblical worldview. And so this issue of Sanger is important to me because of her impact through Planned Parenthood and her push for abortion within the Black community. It's estimated that the Black community is roughly half of what it should be, thanks to abortion. Black women in many states make up the most abortions of any ethnic group. In New York, many years, there are more Black children aborted than born, right? And so a lot of this is due to the work of Margret Sanger. And what makes it so sad is that a lot of people in the Black community, because we're so tied to the Democratic Party, we now advocate for our own destruction. We now advocate for the destruction of our own kids. And so, we chant things like Black Lives Matter. But like I said, the Black community is half. We've lost half of our population because of this woman. And so we just need to talk about it and just break down her worldview and understand what it is she was seeking to achieve. And these are the results. And so I think it's going to be a good conversation.
Yeah, and we'll explore a little bit today too, because that's not an accident. That's not a byproduct of her philosophy and worldview and thinking. That is an intentional outworking of the way she saw the world and the way she wanted the world to be shaped. So we'll dive into that. Hey, Leroy, anything to say before we jump in? I know you're not feeling well today. You're a trooper hanging in here, but anything by way updates in life?
Yeah, it's funny. It's not funny. I should say ironic. I got so many people that I grew up with that would say the white man is out to get me. The white man is out to get me. And I was thinking about it. Actually, after I saw a post from Kevin this morning, well, it isn't the white man is out to get you. It's a particular white woman. Her ideas are still a particular white woman. Her ideas are still killing us, today. I mean, so you put the emphasis on the wrong syllable.
Yeah.
Yeah. It is one of those ironies of this whole thing. I know we've talked for years about critical theories and critical social studies, those sorts of things. And you talk about systemic racism or institutional racism. I prefer institutional over systemic, but that's a whole other topic. But the right says, we need to, those are all wrong ideas. Well, sort of, but we do see that those ideas do exist in some ways, but it's usually because of the left that's built those into our institutions. And then they sort of deflect and try to point in other directions. And this is Sanger's Planned Parenthood is one of those things that worked out in that. So with that framing, let's dive in a little bit here. I want to start with our first worldview questions. And I'm going to actually do the first and the sixth questions together. The questions of how did I come into being and what happens when I die? And those are the big questions of life. Where do we come from? Where are we going? And so really it comes down to connect her ideas to this. Was Sanger a Christian or not? Did she have a Christian worldview? Did she have an atheist worldview? Was she something in between? Anything you guys can think of in what you've read about her that would help people get a sense of how she saw the world?
Was the question, when I saw this question, the first thing I thought was Joe Biden cogent? No, of course not.
Gee.
Of course not. Like, that's how obvious this one. No, she was definitely not a Christian. She definitely did not hold to a Christian worldview. From what I could tell, I would say she was a evolutionist, more of a naturalist. And in terms of like that sixth question, where do you go when you die? She had some very interesting, I'm not going to say thoughts, she had very interesting goals in terms of she felt as if we could reach eternal life here on earth through science. She felt that just as the industrial age was and science was bringing about all of this kind of evolution and machinery, she felt like science could do the same thing to the human body, and that we could actually overcome disease and perfect the human body and live forever. And so when I was reading her work, I felt like I was reading early writings of transhumanism. Like,
oh yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And so that's where I would say she is.
Leroy.
She's, even though she wasn't a formal member, she was heavily influenced by the Fabian Society. And I have my notes here. They were evolutionary socialists. And when I think of Margret Sanger, she's more Hobbesian. In other words, she doesn't believe in religion, but she sees religion as a use. She wants to utilize religion and religious people as a means to forward her ideas. But she is, just as you described, she is a social engineer. She believes that you can perfect the human race through breeding, like we would animal breeding, right? She is definitely in that camp. As a Christian, no. But as a evolutionary Darwinist, eugenicist, social engineer,
Yeah. No, I think you guys hit all the keys there. I mean, her family was ostensibly Roman Catholic growing up, but that was sort of not really the thing. They had the label. It's like when I used to ask kids when I was in college, and we'd go down to do evangelism in Daytona Beach, Florida. And we go say, well, are you a Christian? You say, yes. And they say, why? Well, I was born in America, or my parents go to church, or I was baptized as a kid, or my parents tithed to church. I heard all those answers. And I think that's the extent to which she was Christian by any sense, that she might have considered herself that because she was born in the West. That could probably be about the extent of it. She was certainly a Darwinian. She was a sort of naturalist in the sense that the physical world was there. She's also a little bit into supernatural. She's sort of a spiritualist in the sense, though, because she wasn't just a pure materialist. Let's put it that way. The natural world is all there is, but she was not a materialist, because she did, at the death of her daughter, even she tried to have like these sort of she participated in these like seance like events. She was trying to communicate with her, and she believed she did hear. She had dreams about dead children and all these sort of things. So she had this sort of very spiritualized sense of reality. But I think, Kevin, that ties to your observation that if we could just overcome disease and poverty through eugenist, we'll come to the eugenics. We'll define that a little bit for folks who are not familiar with that term. But if we could refine ourselves, was her idea, then we could live forever and not have to die like that. So, and in the midst of that, she's going to adopt, like many others did, religious language, but that does not in any stretch make her a Christian thinker at all. And that's where people get confused about her, because she would use maybe Christian words. Oh, she's a Christian. Well, she was not. So that sort of really explains just a very natural process has got us where we're, evolution in the past, evolution towards the future. And you're right, Kevin, this is proto-transhumanism. This is exactly where this begins. So let's then move on to our next question. How can I know the purpose for my life? And can I fulfill my purpose? And I want to have those purpose questions together. And for folks, again, worldview questions, when we're really precise in our worldview, we can answer each of these separately. She's not a systematic thinker in that sense. So it really makes sense more for us to kind of combine some of these questions because we're trying to take her ideas and put them in the framework of a worldview, not that she's expositing this worldview clearly. So that's why we compress them together. So it really makes sense to do that for her, as we've done for several of other shows as well. So the first thing I kind of point out in her book, or actually in reading several of her books, is that she says that purpose is found in what she called the feminine spirit. Now, our book that we're working mostly on is Pivot of Civilization. I don't think that's even her best, most clear, let's say, book on these issues. I'm going to share some quotes from Pivot, but I'm also going to share some quotes from a book that she wrote called from Sanger's Woman and the New Race. That's another book that she put together, and they say very similar things, but I kind of find that she's a little more clear in some of her writing in The Woman and the New Race than she is in Pivot of Civilization. And so because of that, I'm going to end up using both for this. And so we'll have quotes that'll go back and forth. And I'll try to make sure I'm always clear what it is. So I'm going to share this quote with you guys, and then I want to get you to feed back a little bit on this. Here's what she says about this feminine spirit. Quote, "Woman's desire for freedom is born of the feminine spirit, which is absolute, elemental, inner urge of womanhood. It is the strongest force in her nature. It cannot be destroyed. It can merely be diverted from its natural expression into violent and destructive channels. The chief obstacles to the normal expression of this force are undesired pregnancy and the burden of unwanted children." So in other words, she's saying that childbearing, the motherhood, is in a sense at odds with the feminine spirit. And I'll have you guys unpack some of that language where we even see it today, that sort of thing. But watch this little clip. This is actually a newsreel clip of Sanger. They call her Margret Slee, which is one of her other last names that she went by. But check out this clip, and then we'll come back and I'll kick it back to both of you guys.
Margret Slee, president of America's Planned Parenthood Federation, maintains that European women should stop having babies for the next 10 years.
But Mrs. Slee, in this country, having babies is the only thing left which is both unrationed and untaxed. Do you think we really ought to stop?
Well, I suppose a subject like that is really so personal that it's entirely up to the parents to decide. But from my view, I believe that there should be no more babies.
There you go. Thoughts on the quote, the feminist spirit and babies? Where is she at, guys?
Oh, it's funny when you were reading that quote, it felt like someone writing something trying to convince others of something that doesn't exist. This whole feminist ethos and this warrior, because, we know what happened to her mother, right? And so her mother didn't display that. And so where is she getting this from, that this is what women have this inner rage? It's like, no, that's what she desires women to have. I think.
So what do you mean by when you say about her mother?
Okay.
Fill in the blank for some folks.
Yeah. So her mother died at a relative young age.
I think she was 48, if I recall correctly.
I believe she got tuberculosis, and one of the reasons they felt it took her down so hard is because she had 11 children. Mm-hmm. And so her body was weak from childbearing and that type of stuff. And so those type of events affected Margret Sanger. And she was 19 when her mom passed away. And so it's like she's trying to so her mom then displayed this warrior ethos. Her mom wasn't trying to get away from the burdens of childbearing and all this type of stuff. These are things that Margret is dealing with and is trying to bring about within women herself. She's more discipling women into this mindset than she is describing something that actually exists, you know.
Go ahead,
Leroy.
No, she is like singing the feminine ethos of our times, isn't she?
She is.
She is singing the feminine ethos of our times. And I often think whenever I look back at those videos about her, that the people that are platforming her are, I think first there's a little bit of curiosity about someone who would speak so openly about their not, destroying babies and women being free, right? And able to determine themselves. I think there's a little bit of curiosity involved there, but I'm also shocked at the level and reach that she had and how many people, so-called enlightened people, agreed with, her ideas. And the whole concept of the feminine spirit, as I said, it captures the ethos of our times. Women are this elemental force, this powerful spirit that is being harnessed, number one, by the cords inherent within society. Number two, by the cords that come with their very nature, childbearing, being the so-called weaker sex. And I think this really is explained by this is Genesis, chapter 1 lived out, that she just wants to be free from both of those cords, the physical cords of weakness and childbearing, and the societal cords of roles and feeling not free to not having freedom of self-expression. So I think that's what her inner rage is, and I think having someone back in that time say those things so openly is kind of a shock for people. Yeah, listen to her. She doesn't sound super intelligent, right? I'm sorry. I mean, she's very bold in what she says. She doesn't strike me as, someone of vast intellect. I'm just evaluating.
No, for sure. So, hey, real quick question. Doug is asking us here, where was she in the order of her siblings? She was not the youngest. I don't remember the number exactly, but I know she's in the middle there somewhere. I know she was like 19 when her mother died, but I'm not sure where she was. Do you guys know the number she was?
I don't. I'm assuming, given her age, that she was the oldest.
6th of 11?
Okay. She was the 6th of 11.
Okay. Yeah, I knew she was in the middle there somewhere. I just couldn't remember it. Yeah. So, but here's the thing, and both of you guys are so right. Look at that. This is why this worldview framing is so critical to this, because there is no God who created man and woman, male and female, to be fruitful and to multiply. Even the process of childbearing is a random process of evolutionary forces. Sexual identity is a random result of sexual, from evolutionary forces. And so none of those things are necessary. None of those things are important. So for her, the childbearing, that's why you hear language today of the fetus is like, it's a leech on the woman. It's a parasite. You look at the transgender movement where you have to have puberty blockers to stop that, because puberty is seen as the enemy of becoming the true person you want to become. And this is all embedded in Sanger's worldview. Now, she wouldn't have necessarily said all of those things that way, right, but it's the consequence of her worldview ideas lived out in the culture and shaped over time, that she has embedded in that feminine spirit, which is greater than motherhood, which is greater than any of those evolutionary forces. And if we can just overcome those evolutionary forces, like Kevin said, you said with science, then we don't have to be a slave. And that's her language. A slave to childbearing. That's what she wanted to end, the slavery of bearing children. And so when we read that feminine spirit, the feminine, all that sort of stuff, we have to recognize that's not talking about the intrinsic nature of womanhood in a biblical sense. And Christians that I'm a Christian feminist, and I believe the feminine spirit. It's like they just don't even understand the language they're using when they use that stuff. So,
interesting,
yeah, Leroy.
I was going to say what's interesting. I was talking to my students in the worldview class, and I always say, hey, think of the 3 tests of a worldview. And the first one is it coherent? The second one is it empirical? It's empirical relevancy. But the third one is, can it really be lived out? Can it really be lived out? Livability. If Margret Sanger had her way, I mean, there would be no more babies at all. This is insanity.
Yeah.
It's not livable.
It's not. It's almost like she was banking on this issue of science, right? And science creating and overcoming. So even the birth control pill, everything is about overcoming our biological urges. Everything is about overcoming the weakness in our bodies, and that's why I say it's like a transhumanism thought, because we can overcome these things with science. And think if we were to get to where she believed we could get to in terms of perfecting our bodies to where we no longer die, then why do you need babies? Yeah. Right? Because no one's going to die. And
it reminds me of...
No, go ahead, Leroy.
There's a little bit delay. There's a delay. So when you pause, It seems like you stop talking. I was going to say, it reminds me of the conditioners in C.S. Lewis's, Abolition of Man. These people get to choose what your highest end is, and your highest end is always within their sphere of control. It is only according to the leash that they allow you to have, and ultimately, what Lewis concludes is that they destroy the very freedom that they think they're giving.
Yeah. So you guys bring up sort of our next point related to purpose. When we talk about, okay, we maybe don't have to have children anymore. What's the purpose of then love and marriage? Sanger adopts this sort of language, and she'll talk about love and beauty and all these sort of things. And some of it sounds like it's compatible with a Christian worldview because she's borrowing in some senses. But I think when we analyze this, folks will see where it doesn't really fit. So I would argue that she says purpose is related to what she considers maternal love. So she relates it to this motherly love. But for me, it ends up sounding a lot like maternal narcissism. Here's what she says. Again, from Woman in the New Race, she says this: maternal love, which usually follows upon happy, satisfying mate love, no, she doesn't say husband love, becomes a strong and urgent craving. It then exists for 2 powerful creative functions. First, for its own sake, and then for the sake of further enriching the conjugal relationship. Okay, so those are things she says are 2, and I'll have you guys jump in on what those purposes are. So again, those 2 powerful creative functions, first for its own sake, so love for its own sake, and then for enriching the relationship itself. It is from such soil that the new life should spring. It is the inherent right of the new life to have its inception in such physical ground, in such spiritual atmosphere. The child thus born is indeed a flower of love and tremendous joy. But, and that's one of the things, but I think it really comes to, she talks about, interestingly, love for her own blood kin, but not others. So she'll talk about the maternal spirit. You love your own child because they're your blood, but not the blood of others, which gets into a sort of blood relationship thing that's interesting. But anyway, what is your takeaway? When she's talking about this maternal love and spirit, what is she really saying there? What is that when it defines the feminine purpose? Kevin, I'll let you jump in because Leroy is drinking.
Yeah.
Not alcohol. For those not seeing the video, not alcohol. It was just like some coffee there. So.
When I read Sanger and I think about kind of her in this regard, everything seems to be centered around freedom and liberation, right? And so when she starts to get to the point where she's talking about fulfilling these purposes, this can only be achieved once we've reached freedom and liberation, especially women, right? Through the control of childbearing. And so once they do have children, it's like they've reached this epitome of self and this epitome of happiness that now children can be born into better environments, right? Mm-hmm. Because her whole issue is the issue in which children are born into, these hard environments. She talks at length about these horrible studies that children have to go to work and all. So it's somewhat utopian, right? Mm-hmm. And so when she's writing about this elite spiritualness and this love, and it's almost like the perfect utopian environment where if we can just go biblical, where all is made right. Mm-hmm. There is no sickness. There is no anger. There's nothing but love and joy, and everyone has reached their true potential and purpose. And it is very, like I say, it's utopian, but it's also very religious in a way, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so that's kind of how I've seen her as I was reading it. It was almost like you were reading someone who was very idealistic of what could be achieved, Yeah.
We talked about socialism last week, or the last time we met. And one of the things that socialists do is they redefine words. They give words a new meaning. So on this view, love and motherhood are all given a new meaning. They're redefined. We think of love as self-giving and sacrificial. For her, it's exactly the opposite. It's selfish.
Yes.
And it's her-centered. The problem with her views is they're not grounded in anything other than her views. I mean, what are they ultimately grounded in? The utopia that she's creating is one that is made in her image. It is her own pursuit of godhood. Here's what makes us free. Here's what it really means to be a human. To be a human is to kill your offspring. To be a human is to kill those who cannot really benefit society or who hinder society. Right? That's what it really means to be human. It's really a smoothed out version of survival of the fittest. I mean, it really is a smoothed out version of the survival of the fittest. But instead of letting natural causes, determine who's fit, the conditioners, Margret Sanger, according to her own moral values and her own worldview, determines who's fit to live in society. Not just who's fit to live in society, who's fit to give birth, whose contributions matter. Who is a real person and who is deserving of death. The fact that so many intellectuals laud this person. I mean, to embrace this person is to tell me in a single sentence that you're evil. I mean, serious.
Yeah, you bring up a couple important things. Again, that worldview thing, there's no God outside. She was definitely connected with some movements that sought the God within. Right? Each person becomes their own God, their own creator of reality. And so there was an intrinsic value in the child that is born out of love, which basically is just self-fulfillment. I find relationships that satisfy me. I find the thing that makes me happy. And then I bring this other being into the world that I can love. But I don't love other people's children because that's not what motherly love is. It's only for my own blood, my own kin. And that ends up opening the door, we'll look at in a little bit, to some of other racialized views of fitness and her views on, people who are disabled or poor and why they shouldn't, which you bring up, Leroy, which is that key thing. But we see it so much in the language today, right? We see how people are saying, well, if I want to abort my child because they won't be brought into the best economic circumstance, the best condition. So that bumper sticker exists today. The slogan exists, but it's born out of this worldview that doesn't value the life itself. And that's just simply the way that she interprets this thing and, as you said, Leroy, redefines that.
Yeah.
Let's get another topic real quick for purpose.
Hold up, Joe.
Oh, yeah.
Hold up, Joe. Yeah. So, because, I mean, this is pretty much the progressive left today, right? And it's like, why is Sanger so enticing? Why has she been so influential? And the term that I was losing before that it came to me is what she's really seeking is the end of all suffering, right? That's what she's really seeking, as suffering shaped her early life, her childhood, right?
Yeah.
And so she's trying to create the world where suffering no longer exists. And we look at the progressive left today, they're seeking to do the same thing. That's why it seems compassionate and it seems like this place of love. But what they're trying to do is not bring a child into the world where suffering exists, right? We can overcome all suffering through the government and through programs and through collectivism. And it's all about overcoming all suffering. And when people read her, I think they share that same aspiration. And they think that this is the way that we can get there, is to constantly be progressing towards these things. And so, I think that's why she's so enticing to people who think that way, because it comes off as compassionate.
Yes. Go for it, Leroy.
What's fascinating is this all depends on sympathy. This whole system depends on sympathy, empathy, compassion. We want to have sympathy and empathy and compassion for the woman's plight, right? The woman who is bound by the cords of society, who is bound by the cords of her body. And it's like you said, she wants to free the woman from those things. But let's look at this just slightly differently. That is the same thing the murderer says. How so? The murderer wants to get out of poverty. So he will kill somebody and take what's theirs, right? Because poverty is a bad thing. He's going to kill somebody to take what's theirs. Maybe the murderer, feels like you are preventing his self-actualization. He's becoming his full self. So he's going to kill you. My nephew, I had a nephew who was murdered for this reason. He's going to kill you because you stand in his way. Or maybe you have something that the murderer wants, right? And he does this. We don't have sympathy and empathy and compassion for men who commit such crimes. As a matter of fact, we generally put them in jail and throw them under the jail because of it. But because these are our mothers, our daughters, our sisters, our aunts, our cousins, we allow our sympathy and empathy and compassion for them to prevent us from actually drawing the conclusions. And in effect, what we do is we adopt their worldview, their perspective on this. And again, that sounds harsh to a lot of people. I know it does. But bottom line, that's the worldview that's being espoused. Women need to be free, as you said. We need to create this utopia where they can be free from childhood, and they get to, select how many children that they're going to bring in the world, which means that they're going to delete other children, right? They're going to do all these things, and we're all supposed to be okay with it. This is why I said this is madness.
Yeah. Leroy, when you talked about cutting those cords, I couldn't think of the umbilical cord, right? She sees herself as chained. Yeah, she sees herself as chained through this cord to the child, and you must cut that cord of slavery to the child. The next part of purpose, though, is you've got to cut your cord to the patriarchy, right? Because the woman cannot find her true feminine spirit as long as the patriarchy exists. And we see that language a lot today. But again, from her Woman in the New Race, here's what she says. Let us see how these principles have affected the development of the present moral codes and some of their shifting standards. When we have finished this analysis, we shall know why objectors to birth control raise the morality question. So just to frame this a little bit, so her thing, obviously, the promotion of birth control, because that's what's going to free her from the cord of the chains to the unborn child, and these moral codes, especially Roman Catholicism, any of these moral limitations on these things are actually what keep women enslaved, right? That's her whole point. So her whole point is the pivot of civilization is a new moral code, and we're living out that code today, right? So the church, she said, this is back to her quote, the church has sought to keep women ignorant upon the plea of keeping them pure. Sexual purity, in other words, is the enslavement. To this end, it has used the state as its moral policeman. Men have largely broken the grip of the ecclesiastics upon masculine education. The ban upon geology and astronomy, because they refute the biblical version of the creation of the world, are no longer effective. Medicine, biology, and the doctrines of evolution have won their way to recognition in spite of the united opposition of the clerics. So too has the right of woman to go unveiled, to be educated, and to speak from public platforms been asserted in spite of the condemnations of the church, which denounce them as destructive of feminine purity. Only in sex matters has it succeeded in keeping the bugaboo alive. All right, Kevin, jump in. There's so much there.
The only thing I can think when I hear that is how successful she's been and how our current generation has drank this Kool-Aid. Because they did take down the patriarchy, right? Are men better today? Is society better today with weaker men and stronger women? I don't think most people would say yes to that. I think we have a lot of issues dealing with the issue of a lack of, we talk about the crisis of young men today, right? And so, I mean, Sanger's worldview and her crusade had a lot to do with that and to where we are today. But yeah, just man, when I hear her, I hear voices today of, Christianity is oppressive. Right. It is holding us back. Like just the whole concept of progressivism. Right. When Sanger she was saying the same thing. She was like, these ideas, this religion, these traditions, this current ideology and way of life is holding us back from reaching our potential. It is holding us back from liberation and from freedom. And it must be overcome. And that's kind of her motto. And that's the motto that led to all of these different movements and social revolutions throughout our current society to bring us to where we are today. And the repercussions have been massive, to say the least, as to her impact and the influence that she's had on our current society and the worldview of most people who, I can say most people, a lot of people who are here today. What you got, Leroy?
Well, I agree. What's interesting to me is I look back at how many the people who agreed with her and who forwarded her ideas. And one guy was the co-founder of the ACLU, probably the most famous pastor of his time, or at least one of the most famous. Harry Emerson Fosdick was another one who forwarded her views. But not just them. How about W.E.B. Du Bois? He was a forwarder of her views. How about Mary McLeod Bethune and Reverend Adam Clayton Powell? I mean, if you are into your African American history or Black history, these are some big names. These folks all supported this view, and they were all progressive. They all had progressive views, and it just, I think the key takeaway is progressive views dehumanize humans. They do. Human beings are not ends in and of themselves. They are instruments to an end. If the end is utopia, and we see this in all of these socialist movements. If the end is utopian, you can't get utopia without breaking some eggs. And sometimes you got to break millions of eggs in order to get this utopia, this ideal society. It is the most completely destructive concept. I mean, known to man, known to man. I mean, I would never wish hell on anybody. I just wouldn't. But yeah, I'm just gonna stop there.
Okay. Well, what you her that little bit of her quote makes so clear. She bought into this entire worldview thinking. The war of Christianity is anti-science. She quotes Draper and White, who were writers in the late 19th century, who invented literally whole cloth this idea that Roman Catholicism was anti-science, that Christianity and broad writ. They would say some, Protestants are okay, but Roman Catholics are super evil. But she read this stuff, and that shaped her thinking. This whole idea that she says here, Christianity tries to suppress biology and all these issues. And then she ties it to the morality, because it's all one thing for her. The biology is the same as the moral convictions about sexual purity. That's not, sexual activity, staying, a virgin until you're married would just be, that's just as unscientific as anything else she can think of, because all of these things are the work of religion, only used to keep the woman oppressed. And that, again, sort of the patriarchy, which hides the purpose of women, goes directly to her idea that it's hidden by the church. So again, last quote from, I think, on this section on purpose, and then we'll transition a little bit here. But again, from The Woman in the New Race, she says, the Roman Catholic Church clings to this last stronghold of ignorance, that is the purity, knowing that women free from sexual domination will produce a race spiritually free and strong enough to break the last of the bonds of intellectual darkness. It is within the marriage bonds rather than outside of them that the greatest immorality of men has been perpetrated. Church and state, through their canons and their laws, have encouraged this immorality, that is the immorality of marriage. It is here that the woman who is to win her way to the new morality will meet most difficult part of her task of moral house cleaning. In the days when the church was striving for supremacy, when it needed single-minded preachers, proselytizers, and teachers, it fastened upon the people the idea that all sexual union in marriage or out of it is sinful. And that part, she's kind of actually true. There's a whole Augustinian tradition that just all sex was evil and corrupt. She's kind of right on some parts there. We can touch on that to whatever degree you guys want. But she says that idea colors the doctrines of the Church of Rome and many other Christian denominations to this hour. Marriage, even for the sake of children, was a carnal indulgence in earlier times, as Principal Donaldson points out in the position of women among the early Christians. So there's a lot of things there. Some things that have some ring of truth, which Protestants have recognized, which is why we don't do, say our priests don't have to be celibate, because they saw celibacy as this moral higher holiness than even in marriage, sexual intercourse was a sin. So she's right about that to some degree, but she distorts that into a globalist statement that even all marriage is a sin. So where are we seeing that today, guys? Where are we seeing that? What are her ideas there? How have you processed that? Kevin, I'll jump in with you.
Yeah. I mean, when I hear this, I just hear a evil woman, right? She is so deranged in her thinking. The idea that marriage is evil, the idea that it's almost, talking about the pendulum swings, right? You can say in one way, oh, the way the church went with that was so far to the right in terms of making all sex sin, which the Bible doesn't say, to everything is a go, right? the sexual revolution and freeing women from the bondage of all of these things. And yeah, when I hear this stuff from her back then, I just hear it today. I just hear the same. It's amazing how influential this woman is in our modern culture. And I'll be honest, until I really started reading her and really diving in, I did not realize that she is pretty much the saint of progressivism. Like the worldview that which they espouse is hers.
Hmm.
You talk about the Marxist stuff. You talk about Foucault. You talk about Jean-Jacques Rousseau. All of these philosophers. But when it just comes to when it all comes together, who brought it all together and said this is it? It's Margret Sanger. And so that's kind of where I land on that with her. The purely evil woman who has had horrendous consequences in our modern culture in terms of the destruction of the family, the destruction of the relationship between men and women. That's a whole nother topic that's going on today. And even throughout abortion, I would say this: we did not reach the utopia she thought we were going to reach. Mm-hmm. I'll say that. Because even if you take about the issue of abortion, now let's talk about the issue of single motherhood, right? Broken families. So it's not like, it was all made into this fulfilling relationship where the woman reached pure freedom and it was all great. It's like, no, the only thing you did was broke down marriage and the family. And now you've just got single mother households and even more issues than we had before, or different issues than we had before. And so, she was completely wrong in where she thought her ideas would lead us to.
And I think it's a different mindset in the country, in the culture back then. It's a little more brutal than and a lot less genteel than we are, even though we would have the same calamity and disaster and destruction going on now. Then, man, somebody take out a gun and shoot you in a second, right?
Yep.
I don't think that life had the same value then. Not to say that, not to excuse what's going on in our society today. And the reason why I'm saying that is because she couldn't in her mind form the idea that what if Christianity was true? What if moms and dads did take care of their families? What if they really cared for their families? What if the highest good of a woman was to help her husband and not to go out and be a boss babe and take over the world? What if the highest good for a woman is to actually raise children and bring children in the world, to actually be fruitful and multiply, and then send those children off into the world and have them raise children? I remember a YouTube commentator told a story of, and this guy is a hated figure, still alive today. And he told a story of a young woman or an older woman today who is, entering her 60s and 70s and late 60s, early 70s, and she's by herself. She's about to die and she has no one, around her bedside other than the few friends he has. And he said, my grandmother, when she was about to die, had 97 grandchildren and grandchildren in the room that came from her body.
Mm.
I mean, obviously not all came from her body, but 97 children and grandchildren, that were in the room. And he said, if no truer words, you talk about leaving a legacy. You talk about leaving a mark in the world. And what Sanger is doing is she's helping you become Esau, changing your birthright for a pot of stew, a pot of pork that's going to satisfy you in the moment, but in the end leaves no lasting fulfillment or legacy.
Yeah,
that's what he's doing.
Yeah. Think about women today though who have followed her, the boss chicks, right? Women who've taken this advice. Mm-hmm. That's what I mean by like this thing that she's writing about, that inner, feminine, whatever, I forgot what she called it. It doesn't exist is made up. And these other women who have read this, adopted it, and tried to live it out, it doesn't exist because they're unfulfilled, right? Because the natural calling of motherhood is still there. The natural calling to be married is still there. And yet these women are completely unfulfilled. We have the highest level of anxiety and antidepressant medication and all of these things in our society today. The more and more women have adopted her worldview and mindset and chased after the things that she, professed and promoted. It has not worked out for women because the thing she was writing about doesn't exist. She was trying to, I don't say speak it into an existence, but, she was writing about it as if it existed when it did. And other people have bought into it and it doesn't exist. Yeah. That's why these women are unfulfilled, because they're chasing something that's fictional.
Yeah. Right. And it's like Doug said in our comments there too, this is what the church has adopted as well. The progressive church has adopted as well. And think about that statement from Fuller Seminary just the other week. And it was on the idea that, of course we affirm the traditional view of marriage. But what they didn't say is the biblical view of marriage. They said the traditional view of marriage. And they didn't tie that to any objective, transcendent reality of covenant relationship. They just said this is just the tradition. But we also accept that other people have new traditions based on their lived experience, and they're just as biblically faithful to have these new kinds of relationships. This is Sanger's point entirely. Well, as long as your relationship is based on this purest love, then all relationships are equally valuable. Whether they're between a man and a woman, or a man and a man, a woman and a woman, or one man and 7 women, or whatever, polyamorous, all these sort of things, the door's open to those because we can redefine it based on our own God-like desires for self-satisfaction. This is where the church has gone. Again, the progressive church has gone. And this is where places like Fuller Seminary, that's what they're advocating for, is a Margret Sanger worldview where we define what those relationships are. They just keep a little more veneer of Jesus than she would have been happy with. But, they're really advocating the same kind of redefinition that she had as well. So this leads us to the moral side of things. So our last two really worldview questions: what's the right thing to do, and how will my life be judged? This is the society, and that last question is the sort of societal piece. Like, how will society judge me and my actions? What is the morally just and good thing to do? Well, as it comes to her view, my first thought was that for Sanger, women must do whatever it takes to free themselves from the chains of our own reproductivity, right? That's kind of what we alluded to before. So moral good is whatever frees her. If having a child is like being in chains of slavery, you do whatever it takes to free yourself from the chains of slavery. And that is the moral good. Again, from her Woman in the New Race, she says this, quote, "The health and longevity of the individual, the economic welfare of the workers," there's, we can see that Marxist socialist worldview coming in, "the general level of culture in the community, the possibility of abolishing from the world the desolating scourge of war, all these, like great human needs, depend primarily and fundamentally on the wise limitation of human output." So we have to reduce the population. That's the only way to end war and poverty, so forth. Then from Pivot of Civilization, she says this, quote, "The moment civilization is wise enough to remove the constraints and prohibitions which now hinder the release of inner energies," in other words, if we have birth control so we can fulfill our sexual desires, "most of the larger evils of society will perish of inanition and malnutrition." I don't know what this is weird. Maybe it's misspelling in the version I had. Anyway, "remove the moral taboos that now bind the human body and spirit, free the individual from the slavery of tradition, remove the chains of fear from men and women, above all, answer their unceasing cries for knowledge that would make possible self-direction and salvation, and in so doing, you best serve the interests of society at large. Leroy, I'm going to kick it to you first this time instead of putting Kevin on the spot all the time. So what do you say? What does that tell us?
What's interesting is the whole purpose of ending war is to stop strife and death, right? But she's not calling for the end of death, right?
Mm-hmm.
She's just calling for the end of destruction of cities, like leave the buildings but kill the people. That's really what she's trying to do. She's not against death per se. She's against the destruction of property, the destruction of things, right? Because war will kill people. That's what war does.
Yeah.
Kills lots of people. But what she's going to do is kill lots of people too. But the only thing she's going to save is the buildings. And, again,
and the best people, the superior people. We'll touch on that in a minute.
Right.
Yeah.
And the more interesting thing about it is, again, who says this, what she wants is right? Whose view gets to win out in the end? What? I mean, we've already said that she's redefining words. If we were really to set out definitions for everything that she says, I think what we would find is a very ugly world that she's attempting to bring into to view. And just from a more contemporary note, isn't this exactly the same idea that David Hogg said just recently when he said, we just need to free these people up so they can just have more sex? That's what guys want. We need to just talk about so that so guys can be free from their responsibilities. It's the same ideas. It's worn out, man. They're all worn out.
Yeah. When I think of Sanger's view, the word I thought of was pragmatism, right? If it leads to the end goal, then it's the right thing to do. That's kind of her moral framework. And she understands that human beings have this innate need or desire for sex. But the problem is that produces children. And so her whole goal is to detach the desire from the consequence, right? And that's what her whole birth control thing was doing, and what she thought was going to lead to this kind of utopian outcome of, oh yeah, we can allow people to get their urges out in whichever way they need to or choose to, but without the consequences of any type of children coming into the world. And she thought that was going to make the world a better place. Less child labor, less starvation, less, unhappy women and mothers being forced to have kids. Like this was what she thought was going to lead to this new kind of better place. And her moral framework was just whatever works to get us there is right and moral, right? Anything that is against that is wrong and needs to be done away with. And so this woman's a very single-minded, self-centered person who really couldn't see anything outside. Even though it's coming off as compassion, it's really still all about her,
Yeah. It's a very selfish love. And as my dog makes his way into the room here, made it on camera, it actually kind of sparks something too. But think about the language we have today of doggy parents and all these sort of things. This is the kind of self-satisfying love where animals replace the reality of what we would normally have through children. We find other things to love that will love us unconditionally the way we want to be loved, but it's all about the self, right? That's kind of what we find in Sanger. That's kind of what we see in this situation. So, okay, now he's getting one side of my room. So I'm going to make a noise, and then you're going to hear my doggy leave.
Animals can't hurt you, and guess what? They're disposable. Always give them up.
Or I'll give you one better. Is a joke on, I've seen it on Facebook on memes. If you lock your wife and your dog in the trunk, which one's going to be happy to see you when you open it up, right? It is. That dog is going to be so happy. That dog is going to be jumping around like, oh, how you came back. And one of them is not going to be that way. And so
yes, you don't have to improve yourself or your life for an animal. They love you the way you are, flaws and all. But for humans, relationships, marriage, you have to change yourself. You have to you have to face the fact that you aren't a perfect God. You aren't the person you think you are. That when you're in conflict and forced to refine yourself and forced to submit yourself to care for someone else in the way that they need to be cared for, you have to realize, I'm not perfect. I am flawed. And what this Sanger worldview is really saying, you are perfect the way you are. It's that whole thing of you are perfect, little Tommy and little Susie, and everybody gets a trophy, right? Because you don't need to change anything. Come to church. God loves you just the way you are. And never change, because God doesn't want you to change, because he made you perfect. God could never make anything wrong. If God is a good God, he doesn't make anything bad. So any feeling you have, any desire you have, is the right feeling and desire. And this is what becomes the foundation for moral justice and goodness, is that whatever satisfies your desires, and if that desire is to end the life of your baby because it's the baby's life is dependent on the perspective of the mother, this will cause you mental anguish or trauma or sorrow or grief or stress, well, then just don't do it. And that baby has no life intrinsically, inherently. The life only has value in the value you give it. And this is exactly what she argued, right? The motherhood spirit loves her own, but not the other, right? The motherhood loves that. And so that leads to one of the big points that we need to get to, where people jump to a lot of times right away. When it comes to that, who are the people, like you said, Leroy, that are disposable? Well, for Sanger, the moral justice, the moral good, is to do whatever it takes to purify the human race. Right? The human race. So when we use this word race today, we're meaning white, black, Asian, those sort of things. As this term was invented, it came up in the Enlightenment era, the late 1800s, or the late 1700s, 18th century. We have these Enlightenment concepts with guys like Hume, and they come up with this concept of race. And there was always different numbers of races depending what they were. But when you read literature of this period, like even if you look at Nazi literature, it talks about the human race. It doesn't necessarily refer to different races like black and white. There's this concept that we are one race of people, which is why the term gets a little confusing. But at the same time, she did recognize there were different inferior people who would corrupt the race of humans, the pure race of who we could evolve to become. We're on a trajectory to this great end. And so we have to make sure the race is purified. We talked about that word about eugenics earlier, social Darwinism. Eugenics just means good breeding. So let's breed well. And Darwin himself said, just like we breed cattle for the best beef, and then we go to a fair and judge them, here's your grade A beef, here's the blue ribbon pig. Humans are the same thing. We can breed ourselves to better humanity. And they used to have eugenic fairs, by the way, where people would come and they would judge the Smiths and the Joneses just like they judged the Holsteins and the cattle, and they would give them blue ribbons and medals. This is the fittest family. And there was whole projects, and there were sermon projects. The best eugenics sermon project. You mentioned Fosdick earlier, Leroy. He's used today in sermon classes. I remember coming across him in a homiletics class as the father of sort of modern preaching and this great model of preaching. But nobody talked about his moral compass. But hey, he was, he's a Christian, so let's look at this idea. So these ideas creep in, and so Sanger certainly looked at her desire. Again, this is from her book, Woman and the New Race. Again, her new morality is connected to this new desire for a new race of human beings. She says this: if we are to develop in America a new race with a racial soul, we must keep the birth rate within the scope of her ability to understand as well as to educate. Now, I want to make a comment about that word soul really quickly too, because Hitler would write about that in Nazi literature. You see that, it'll ask, there was a piece of propaganda, they say, does the same soul dwell in these people? And have pictures of indigenous peoples like from Australia or Africa next to these sort of white European people. And they say, does the same soul dwell in these people? And atheists, see, he was Christian, he was religious, he's using that soul language. Soul did not mean that in the Darwinian worldview. Soul meant almost like you could maybe in the sense like Soul Man, like the movie, like, oh, that guy's got soul, that old sort of maybe 70s sense of the word. It's a character, it's a nature. It talks about what maybe we would today say is human personhood, right? So we're all humans by birth, but some of us are more persons than others. Some of us greater value. So when she's saying the new racial soul, she's talking about as a human race, we have to have this new identity as persons of who are the best people. So we have to keep the birth rate again within the scope of our ability to understand as well as to educate. So anytime we can't keep people educated properly or bring them up in the right way, we have to eliminate those populations. And that, of course, meant when she was writing, she'd talk about the race problem, the Asian problem, the Chinese problem in California. You guys can maybe dialogue. Kevin, you alluded to this at the front end. She wanted to go into the black churches and convince the black leaders that you need to tell your women to, use birth control. She wasn't a super fan of abortion necessarily. She thought that was a little bit crude, but you could take care of it by pre-aborting babies through birth control. That was sort of the mentality. But that's sort of a separate issue we could discuss if people are interested. But before we get into that, how she interpreted that quote I just read, I want to show one more clip. This is in recent years. Now, conservatives, Christians used to fight for that idea that Margret Sanger was a racist, and people would gaslight and say, no, she never was, whatever. But then once the internet gets a hold and you can actually read what she writes, they had to acknowledge this. And so recently, this gets acknowledged. And this clip is from ETWN News or something like that. It's a pro-life news organization. But here's what they acknowledge. This is a story that recently took place in Planned Parenthood, recognizing exactly what we're saying is true.
Planned Parenthood's largest affiliate is removing founder Margret Sanger's name from its Manhattan facility over what it calls her racist legacy. In what's a surprising admission from the abortion industry, Planned Parenthood of Greater New York is removing founder Margret Sanger's name from its Manhattan facility because of what it called her, quote, harmful connections to the eugenics movement. In a statement released last week, a spokesperson for the affiliate called stripping away Sanger's name both a necessary and overdue step to reckon with our legacy and acknowledge Planned Parenthood's contributions to historical reproductive harm within communities of color. This is the same New York Planned Parenthood affiliate that in June ousted its CEO after an open letter accused her of unfair treatment towards black staff members, among other abuses. Planned Parenthood has long defended or deflected on its founder's eugenics past. Hear how a video celebrating Planned Parenthood's first 100 years addresses the controversy.
Margret worked with civil rights leaders, immigrant women, and black communities, but also aligned herself with eugenicists. Ugh. It doesn't seem to make sense. But way back in the early 20th century, eugenics was an immensely popular social movement, one with the kind of widespread legitimacy Margret craved for her own birth control campaign.
What a dishonest framing. She worked with immigrant communities? Yeah, because she thought they were unclean and impure and wanted them to not reproduce.
Yeah.
Somebody take over before I get too wild here.
It just makes you so frustrated with the media and how they just lie. That was propaganda. I mean, it was well done propaganda, but it was propaganda. This woman, I mean, her words, human weeds, inbred, just the things that she used to describe the people she did not want to reproduce, right? Mm-hmm. And who those people were. And there's no coincidence that a lot of Planned Parenthoods today are within inner city black communities, because that's the target. And I'm be honest, taking her name off the building or whatever, what does that do? You're still carrying out her mission. Nothing changed. But what they did not do is ever question what they were really there for. And what they're there for is to stop the quote unquote undesirables from reproducing, right? Even if you try to spin it in a positive light, well, this is about poverty and we just want to give woman's choice. Like, no, that's not what it's about. That came later as a spin on it. It is about these quote unquote people those people not reproducing. And like I said, because of her work, the Black community today is half of what it should be. We're at about 40 million Black people in America, and we should be around 80, except we've killed millions and millions and generations of our own people following this woman's work. And that's not even talking about, like, just the impact of birth control and limiting how many children you have. No, we're just talking about just the number of abortions and how many kids those people would have had by now. And just people who do not exist that should have existed because of her work. And so, very evil woman. And and it's just it's so frustrating because the Black community today has bought into believing that this woman is some type of hero and we need to vote for the people who uphold her beliefs and policies. And it's mind blowing that we've been able to be this duped into going along with this thing.
I was going to say, I've always thought about what's the connection with the leaders in our government bringing in so many illegal immigrants to society. And one of the large connections is we need people to pay for the previous generation, right? We need people here to work and pay taxes, or the whole system falls apart. Well, why is the system falling apart? Probably because we've killed like 73 million people. I mean, you kill 73 million people over, 50 years. Your system, if it's built on one generation, bringing in the next generation, is going to fall apart. Another thing that I think about is she views people like she views animals. The only people that you really, the only sense in which this conversation really has, you can really see it in all its full light, is when you listen to farmers talk about breeding animals and what animals are allowed to breed and what animals are not allowed to breed, what animals need to become geldings, right? So that they cannot reproduce. When you listen to farmers talk, that's exactly what this language mirrors. And notice, it was Martin Buber who said, we have different relationships between I's and thou's and I's and its. When we have a relationship between an I and thou, that's me and you having a relationship. You're a you, you're a something, someone, you're a person. But Buber said, we have different relationship with its. If there's an it, like my pen is an it, my cell phone is an it, my car is an it. I have a different relationship with my car or my pen or some non-living thing that I don't have with another person. And the problem with that is I can do to my pen, my car, my phone, whatever I want, and there's no necessary moral issue that accrues to it, because these things are its. But when you treat people like its, you dehumanize, you make them into something less than human, and then you're able to destroy them. This is exactly what Hitler did with the Jews and all the propaganda of the 1930s before he tried to solve the problem in its final solution. And what Margret Sanger is doing is bringing a more genteel discussion to the so-called intellectuals. And this is the kind of conversation that appeals to intellectuals, because think about it. The conversation that you and I would be having we would already have this view that we're above it all, that we are the elite, right? And who are we talking about? We're talking about the less than elite. We're talking about the its, right? And you and I already agree, we implicitly agree, so we can do to them whatever we want to, because they are not us. They are less than us. That's the whole conversation that she's having here.
Yeah, it's a very tribalized view. It's people don't really understand, unless you start to read this stuff, just how dystopian and tribalistic and animalistic this worldview thinking is. I mean, tens of thousands of people were forcibly sterilized in this period of time. Sanger supported these things. You look how they were sterilized because they were either in insane asylums or whatever, because there was this belief that these were blood-borne realities. In other words, you passed on certain illnesses. And actually, it goes back to even Darwin's time. There was doctors in the South who because they had this evolutionary view of African peoples, that they were lower on this evolutionary scale, they would do experiments on them without anesthetic because they believed they have this higher tolerance for pain, but then they would research on them to find out what they could, different ways they could do medical experiments so that they could do it well on white people. But because they saw them as lower humans. Oh, they're still humans, but just lower or less than, in some way not as valuable. And they even argued at the time, when many blacks were freed from slavery, they'd go in and they'd end up with diseases, or they'd end up with mental illnesses. And they didn't make the connection, well, maybe that's because they were brutalized in the system of slavery. And then when you free them with no one to hire them and no place to go because society is still rejecting them, maybe that's, no, it must be because they're reverting to this sort of animal brain reality that they needed.
Like from the very beginning.
Well, yeah, but they actually argued that they must be treated like animals and brutalized because that's the only way that nature has equipped them to survive. So it was slavery became a moral good, not just a necessary evil, but in the late 19th century, it became a moral good to keep them enslaved because that's the only way they couldn't revert to their lower base animal instinct. And Sanger had this very same thing. The poverty was a genetic issue. It was a biological. You pass down poverty and other illness and theft and robbery. All were genetically transitioned. So you have to keep those people from reproducing. That's why she put one of her first clinics in Harlem in New York, and then she convinced the black pastors and the black leaders, oh, this is going to be the help to your women. It's the language we see today. Oh, if we defund Planned Parenthood, what's going to happen? Oh, we're going to harm the black community. Minorities will be hurt and hit the hardest. That language is just like we saw in the video, it's such a distortion of what's actually happening. So harming them means allowing them to have babies. Right? And if you want to actually encourage black people to have babies, then you are the racist because you want more black people in the world. They redefine everything, and it's so distorted and deformed. It is just mind blowing. Kevin, I know you want to jump in with something there before we go to our last point here.
Yeah. I just want to read this quote from The Pivot of Civilization because she's borrowing from the Sermon on the Mount and to make her point about eugenics and birth control. And she says, a corrupt tree cannot bring forth good fruit. Neither can a good tree bring forth evil fruit. Every tree which bringeth not forth good fruit is hewn down and cast into the fire. We wish to apply these words not only to the actions of individuals which spring from their characters, but to the character of individuals which spring from their inherent qualities. Their inherited qualities, right? So she's like, if you don't bring forth good fruit, then you are to be thrown and you'll be cast away, right? That's the principle because it is something inherent with you. You inherit these qualities down, and we don't want to see you pass them down to someone else, right? So she took Jesus' parable and completely made it something evil. To demonstrate, the eugenics and birth control arguments.
That was a common verse, by the way, used in her time to an interpretation of that amongst eugenists. You can read that in quite a bit of the literature of the day by pastors. Yeah.
That's horrible. When I read that, it blew my mind out. And so and that's crazy. I've heard some Christians today who've adopted more of a neo-Nazi ideology say some of these same things about blacks not being fully as to whatever whites are, right? And they've used these same type of inherited limitations as arguments, whether it's even the argument of IQ and all this type of stuff.
Yeah.
And so what sadly is that not only is her ideas prevalent on the left, a lot of this stuff is starting to come back on the political right.
Yeah, that's the danger.
It is. It is. Yeah. And so, yeah, when I was, reading this stuff, and I was thinking, I've been dealing with this stuff on the political right recently. The same ideas. It's like, hold up, who would have thought that people on the political right who would call themselves Christians and call themselves conservatives would be spouting Margret Sanger type beliefs?
Yeah.
Well,
and that's the thing is, it's, the Nazis at least were direct. Like, they believed that these groups were inferior. Sanger was pretty direct about it too. But after people discovered what Hitler was doing, you can actually read through the literature amongst the eugenists. We have to change our PR, essentially. We have to change our language.
Yeah.
This idea of my body, my choice, you get that concept after Hitler in the literature. We have to convince people that they're willingly doing this because we can't do the great work that Hitler was accomplishing anymore because there's too much political pushback for it. And so you get the softer version of it, but you see it when you do man on the street interviews. I mean, the progressive view is that, well, of course a black person can't get ID. They're not capable of such complex thinking as to get an ID to vote. That would be horrible. I mean,
kids we can't trust. Don't even know what a computer is.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, they can't get on this internet thing, and they don't know how to access information. We love them. We're this paternalistic group that knows that they're just inferior and can't accomplish these great feats of identification. It's the same view. They're just doing it because we love them.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. That's so patronizing.
Yeah.
You muted, Leroy. Leroy, you're muted.
Leroy. I didn't do it, Leroy. It wasn't me. I'm not keeping you down. Oh, okay.
Two of the most interesting ideas were, piggybacking on what you said, were about human development is Piaget and a guy named Vygotsky. I listened to that, the neo-Nazi guy who was saying what blacks are incapable of.
Yeah.
And I think his name is Mar.
It is.
And what's very interesting is in sociological writings, you could actually make that case in terms of human development, because Vygotsky, for example, argued that culture is determinative. And if you grew up in a culture that doesn't value education and all these other sorts of things that go on, then of course your intellect will be lower. Of course your lifestyle or your culture will be lower. The problem with that is it's ridiculously determinative. In other words, there's nobody who's black who can grow up in poverty and rise above those circumstances. That's the idea that all these people are arguing. Blacks can't have a computer. Why? Blacks are in poverty. Blacks can't be intellectual. Why? Because they go to poor schools. Blacks can't value family and be fully developed by the Holy Spirit. Why? Because they lack the education. They don't get good teaching. On and on and on. There's always an excuse in these guys, especially coming from the church aspect. These guys they take the second order things, and they make them the primary things. And they argue for that what we need is peace, order, goodness, and justice. So they're going to fixate on peace, order, goodness, and justice, because these are the things that, for them, create healthy societies. But those things, peace, order, goodness, and justice, are instrumental. They're not ends in and of themselves, right? If you pursue peace, order, goodness, and justice, you've got to kill a lot of people to get peace. Mm-hmm. Order. You've got to crush disagreement. You've got to use power. It's all an appeal to power, which is why people like that guy have not fully digested what Christianity is all about. They've not fully digested Christ at all. Not sacrifice, not love, not grace, not mercy, right? Not living to glorify God. And if you did do those things, then you would get peace, order, and justice, right? But they would be byproducts of becoming the kind of people who love peace, order, and justice instead of the kind of people who want to coerce that within everyone else. And this is all progressive. It's It's Sanger going in the same direction as Sanger, but using slightly different argumentation to make the same case. It's all destructive, and it's all just a very ugly view of what man is. Yeah. It's a very nasty anthropology.
Yeah. So that whole idea, it was sort of a next point, but we've kind of covered this. I just want to give a couple quick quotes. So when she talks about was morally good or just, she says, okay, you have to limit who can give birth, right? That's the key thing. She really doesn't want the death and dying of people that are more formed. She wants it to happen where you can't see it happen. So that's sort of her ideal. She wants to feel like she's a better person for that she's evolved in some sense in her moral sensibilities. But it's really the same argument. So in Pivot to Civilization, she says this: each feeble-minded person is a potential source of endless progeny of defect. We prefer the policy of immediate sterilization so that parenthood is absolutely prohibited to the feeble-minded. And then she goes on to say, birth control has been accepted by the most clear-thinking and far-seeing of the eugenicists themselves as the most constructive and necessary of the means of racial health. So there we see that idea, again, coming to the forefront of the racial health and idea. So the last point I want to get, and then we'll close with some thoughts for Christians, is that the other way to achieve the moral ends is to limit who can vote. So we have a lot today about, it's the right wants to suppress the black vote, blah, 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 blah. But it's the progressives who really ultimately, historically, wanted to limit the ability of the unclean, unwashed masses to vote. And this is what Sanger said: the danger of recruiting our members from the most fertile stocks is further emphasis. So fertile stocks, she means the poor, because they have bigger families. So she's like, if we get allies among the poor and the black and the Asians and the other unwashed, unclean, inferior people, she's like, okay, we could recruit them, but here's the problem. It further emphasized when we recall that in a democracy like that of the United States, every man and woman is permitted a vote in the government, and that it is representatives of this grade of intelligence who may destroy our liberties and who may thus be the most far-reaching peril to the future of civilization. Equality of political power has thus been bestowed upon the lowest elements of our population. We must not be surprised, therefore, at the spectacle of political scandal and graft, of the notorious and universally ridiculed low levels of intelligence and flagrant stupidity exhibited by our legislative bodies. You're not wrong about that. The congressional record mirrors our political imbecility. So, well, I mean, two things can be true at once. But what she's really saying is that when we give voting rights to the inferior, we end up with an inferior political body politic, right? And so she's blaming that on minorities and the intellectual, people that she wants to sterilize so that they can no longer, contribute their vote to corrupting the real liberties of society. Anything surprise you about that sort of approach she has, or anything maybe kind of concern you about where you see that in the political rhetoric today?
In the political rhetoric today, I will go with someone who called her basically like an icon and a mentor and used the same word that she used. Talking about a different group of people, though, and that is Hillary Clinton when she called Trump voters deplorables, right? Yeah. Who did Margret Sanger not want to reproduce? The deplorables.
Yeah,
right?
She's exactly that language.
It's the exact same language, and it's in the same way of these people are, and Obama clinging to their Bibles and their guns, right? These people are of the wrong stock. They're of the wrong ideology. And they're holding us back from progress, right? Mm-hmm. And it's the same type of
threat to democracy.
It's just pointing at a different group of people. If they had it their way, they would say, man, we really wish, especially, these people in rural areas who are having these kids. And I'll say this too, because it's not really a different group. Because we talk about Margret Sanger's, how she, felt towards minorities. What we don't bring up enough is how much she hated poor whites, because not only were they poor, but she felt like because they were white, they should know better. And so she had a higher disgust for them than she did for minorities, because minority blacks, we just don't know any better. We can't help ourselves. Poor whites who did this kind of behavior, she had a higher contempt for. And so those are the people in which Hillary Clinton is also talking about, and which Obama is talking about, right? These people in white rural Americans who have a lot of kids, who, you know, love their Jesus and cling to their guns, and they are holding up the progress. And if it was up to them and Margaret Sanger, those type of people shouldn't be able to vote. You know? Yeah.
Leroy.
And so it's great. It's I mean, this woman has an amazing impact.
That's called intellectual snobbery.
Yes.
Joe and I have a favorite foil who employs intellectual snobbery. I didn't want to bring up his name in the context of this conversation. That wouldn't be fair.
Yeah. But a lot of academics do, even Christian academics.
I call them the smarties, the so-called smarties. Love intellectual snobbery, to look down on those who are less educated than they, as if they have less value, as if their voices don't matter, as if they are of no worth whatsoever. And ultimately, to those people, they are its. And you can do whatever you want to an it. You can limit its existence. You can limit its flourishing. You can limit its passions, its desires, and its will. Because you are elite. You are greater than they are. And therefore, you can do to them, you can throw them in jail on trumped up charges for years. You can shoot them because you think that they are a threat to you. They are less than human. And that is that is the root of that idea. That is the root of that idea.
You know, Katie made a comment here that I want to address because it kind of sparked this little thought for me. Because you read Sanger's statement there, and she talks about, you know, not wanting the, you know, blacks or Asians or other, you know, Mexicans certainly, or any of those people, and even poor whites or anybody to vote, because that destroys our democracy. And then we think, oh, it's flipped today because now the progressives want those minority votes. Well, they want the votes, but they don't actually want them because they believe they have an equal humanity. They want them because they're easily manipulated to get the end goals that they have in mind. So just like Sanger manipulated the black community saying, oh no, this is for your benefit. You know, we're going to convince these people. I mean, she gave speeches in front of the KKK, women's groups. She was not shy about her ultimate goals when she wrote this stuff. People just hide it better today. But I do think the progressives are in the exact same boat. Yes, they've just found a way to get, you know, 90% of a particular minority, like say black vote or whatever, you know, block. But as soon as those people, you know, go off the reservation, now I'm mixing my metaphors here, then they're no longer count. And you, Kevin, and you, Leroy, know that better than anybody. When you don't toe the line, when you are off the plantation, and I'm using that language very intentionally here, you are allowed to be brutalized. Leroy and we've had conversations. My white progressive friend can call Leroy an Uncle Tom, and he said that's not a racist term because I can call him this racial epithet because I'm on the right side. I'm on the side of justice. And so even though they pursue today, progressives, the vote of the people that Sanger said are deplorable, they just found a way around the problem to manipulate that group of people. But I honestly believe they feel the same way. We saw just the other day in the LA thing that the black woman is stuck in traffic, and she's like, hey, I'm trying to get through the traffic. I'm trying to feed my kids. And the white progressive dude standing there, you know, people call him soy boy kind of guys. You know, he's like, oh, you've got a job. Oh, you go to work. He doesn't care about her. He doesn't care about her as a black woman, even though he would say, oh, I'm for minorities, but not in a collective sense, but not in an individual sense.
Only in use to his cause.
Exactly.
Yes. And so I've been somewhat distracted while we've been recording this, because I don't know if you guys are aware, but there was a shooting in Minneapolis where 4 people got killed and 2 were Democrat politicians. And it's come out that the person who did the shooting is also a Democrat, former Tim Walz appointee in Minnesota. And this woman who was gunned down and her husband who was gunned down had recently voted with the Republicans with some stuff. And so here she is. She went against the grain, and now her life is gone.
Wow.
At least that's the early reports. That's the early narrative based on what happened is that she had recently voted across the aisle on some immigration stuff.
But this is bound to happen. I mean, once you've ratcheted the rhetoric up this high, that the people who you are against are Hitler, right?
Yeah.
You've demonized them, you've turned them into objects, and you can do what you want and go and kill them. This is where this rhetoric goes. It's where it goes. And it's like,
I'm saying, like, the message has been sent: don't cross the aisle, don't leave the plantation, or else. That's the message, you know. And that's what was coming to me when you guys were talking. Like, yeah, this person just sent the message, like, there will be no toleration of leaving plantation. No.
Yeah, and there's an irony here, and we'll close up after this in a second because we've gone over our normal time. But this is such a rich topic. I don't mind. Hopefully, folks don't mind at all. But Leroy or Kevin, either one of you. I know Leroy we've talked about before, so I don't know, Kevin, where you at. If you look at the Uncle Tom's Cabin, looking at that racial epithet, I think that actually embodies a lot of what we're talking about, because in that story, Uncle Tom is actually not the bad guy.
No, he's not.
But in the culture, he's the bad guy. Why is that different? One of you kind of used that story to illustrate. 'Cause I think you guys both know it well enough that you can make that connection to what we're talking about with Sanger. Talk about that if you could.
I don't know if I can talk about it on a deep level, but I mean, I just look at it as, it's Uncle Tom's Cabin. And so the sentiment of calling someone as an Uncle Tom is more so, we know what it means. It means a sellout to their own race and all this type of stuff. And even though it was a different character in the book, right? The book is called Uncle Tom's Cabin. So that type of description, you just get called an Uncle Tom.
But who was the character in the book? I guess maybe if one of you could just paint that out for folks. Who was he actually in the book? What did he do, or what did he accomplish in the storyline? Do you guys recall? I know I'm putting you both on the spot.
No, he was a slave, and he was drawn by Harriet Beecher Stowe as a Christ-like figure.
Yeah.
It's drawn as a Christ-like figure at a pivotal point in time with the goal of humanizing blacks to whites, to argue to the intellectuals who would read her book that these people are worthy of dignity. Now, what's very interesting, and it's so funny, I was just looking up, I have a history book in my office. I was looking for this very story on Thursday. When that book was written, two news guys in the South went out of their way to destroy that book and create Uncle Tom as a very ugly figure, as a subservient figure rather than the Christ figure, because what was their goal? Their goal was upheaval, destroying the system. They didn't believe that this story could be used to not guilt white people, but to awaken their consciences. And nor did they want to do that. They wanted the Nat Turner black, right? So they're the ones, these two guys went out of their way to demonize and create this caricature of Uncle Tom as some subservient black person, rather than a Christ-like figure he was meant to be.
Yeah, and I think that's where I was kind of thinking about the Sanger kind of idea, is that there's a insurmountable gap between black and white in the progressive worldview. You cannot overcome that gap. Certainly there cannot be peace and reconciliation between those two groups. And anytime you get an Uncle Tom figure who could possibly bridge that gap, then that person must be vilified and seen as the enemy. Yeah. Because that guy is the enemy, because you are making an ally of white people and trying to see them as value. But we don't. We have to destroy. We have to overcome, and so it's that narrative of destruction. And so Sanger saw the whites needed to destroy the blacks, and now any type of peace was beyond measure. Now it's that sort of same mentality flipped the other way. We see the divide, the tribalistic divide. So with that in mind, let's close up here. Any final thoughts? Where can Christians use these ideas we've talked about? Just pick one thing, maybe say, okay, Christians, this is the gospel opportunity in this. Where is it that we could go out and have a conversation? What do we need to bring up? What ideas could we use that could actually open the door to the gospel in this very divisive and destructive ideology?
I would just simply say right off the bat, honesty. Be honest about what Margret Sanger believed, and be honest about what she thought about you, and then be honest about whether her ideas are ideas that ought to be embodied in your life, right? So let's think about who Margret Sanger was and how she viewed people, and then ask the next question: am I going to allow the same idea? Even if I try to disconnect it from her, am I going to allow this same idea to govern how I'm going to see people, and how I'm going to relate to people, and how I'm going to pursue my life? I mean, I think a lot of people can easily rationalize being her away as if she's not really a big figure, but at the same time, embody her ideas. So I think if we call people to honesty, to really give her an honest look and then ask, is this someone whose views ought to be embodied in any way in my life? I think that in and of itself is, can open the door for the gospel to be heard, because then you'd have to say, yeah, I've embodied these ideas and now I need to do something else.
Yeah. I'll just kind of piggyback on that and saying, like, being honest about not only who she was and what she believed, but being honest about what has her work produced, right? Mm-hmm. Let's just be honest about where women really are today, and women actually evaluating and saying, did I buy into something from someone who was inherently evil, who sold something that I bought into, and I lived based on these principles, and bring those people back? We've seen this with the resurgence or the return or the repentance, I would call it, the repentance of the new atheist movement, right? Mm-hmm. They saw all of these ideas get carried out to their end degree, and they realized, oh no, we actually do need Christianity. These things are actually good. These things are not the bad in society. These things are actually holding society together, right? Yeah. And I think we need to capitalize more on that to get more people to realize that Christianity is what's needed. And the tossing out of Christianity or framing Christianity as the evil, oppressive thing that held us back really sent us down a bad road. It is a world that is eventually rooted in nothing. Like you said, her ideas aren't rooted in anything. And when you have an idea that's not rooted in anything, you have no way of controlling where it goes. And we know where this thing leads to. And so I think that's what we can do, is just remind people of the gospel is needed. Christianity is needed for the flourishing of society, because without it, you end up with crazy world.
Yeah, to that end, I would just add as my final thought here is that we need to watch our language. And that is two things. One is we've seen how the progressives through Sanger, they'll manipulate the language to make it seem like you're doing a good thing when you're doing an evil thing. It's the whole 1984 kind of project, right? It's the new speak. It's the new way of, we're helping blacks by helping them kill themselves off. We're actually, that's actually love, we're redefining all of these things. And so we have to be super careful. It's tough because we've got to communicate to people who have a different worldview. So in some way we have to use their language, but we don't want to let their language define or redefine the essence of the gospel, which Christian progressives do all the time. They adopt the language and then try to use that to reread the scripture to do that. Help the immigrant or whatever it is, and they're going to reimagine all these things. But I'll give one specific example where we can, in a positive way, make a change. And I've been advocating for this for years. in philosophy, in the higher ed kind of world, we talk about human and personhood. And there's this distinction between what a human is and what a person is. We saw how Sanger used the word soul, which is what today we'd use as person. I think Christians should stop, if we could, not stop using the language of personhood, but try to reinforce that human person is really about human sacredness. Right, that the baby is not just a human person from conception; they are sacred human. In other words, they're made as image bearers to God, because we shouldn't shy away from our worldview commitment that we are all created B'Tselem Elohim in the image of God, and therefore, from that moment of conception, have value. So it doesn't matter if you are poor, if you are have some sort of mental disability. It doesn't matter if you're a thief or a criminal, if you are black or Hispanic or white or whatever. We all have the same sacred worth because we are image bearers of God. And even if you do evil things and defile the image of God in you, you are still made in the image of God. And I am obligated by God to treat you as that image bearer. And I think that idea of human sacredness, it's language that we could use that doesn't give up the game. Like, we can't argue for the value of human life on a secular foundation. We need to say, okay, look, we might have points of agreement, but you have to come to my foundation if you're going to actually value life. And I think that begins with recognizing the sacred value of every human being. All right. Well, thank you, gentlemen. Kevin, great to have you as always. It's been a while, but it's always fun. Leroy, is glad you were a trooper. I forgive you for not muting your mic at key moments, for blowing your nose, even though I warned you about that. So I still love you, brother. I will value the image of God in you, even though you defiled it in all of us by making us hear that noise.
I tried to catch it, but it didn't work.
Yeah. Everybody noticed that. Yeah, thank you, brother. Yeah. But I still love you, my friend. So anyway, I'll have a lot of the links to some of the videos we looked at, the books we've talked about in the show notes. You can find those at morethancake.org. Come back, check us out later, and God bless. There is so much more that we could say about Sanger's new morality, but for now, I want to encourage my brothers and sisters to go out and till the soil of culture so that you can raise the roof by exposing your friends and family to the beauty of marriage, childbirth, and raising godly family. I hope you'll come back and join me for the next episode. In the meantime, don't forget to follow and rate the show on your favorite podcasting service. And if you want to participate with me in a subscribers-only question and answer, you can sign up through my website, morethancake.org.